Welcome, dear listener, to this atmospheric journey through the fog-draped streets of Victorian London. As you settle in for an evening of historical immersion, I invite you to pause and share where you're tuning in from and the hour gracing your corner of the world. It's heartening to envision our global community of night owl historians, bound by a love for the past. If these narrative-rich strolls through forgotten eras soothe your soul, consider subscribing for nightly escapes into history. Now, let's turn the clock back to the 19th century, an age of glittering palaces and squalid slums, of imperial grandeur and human suffering. Victorian London was a tapestry of stark contrasts, where beneath the opulence of high society festered a world of gut-wrenching poverty, where survival itself was a daily battle. Picture, if you will, the grim labyrinth of London's East End. Rickety tenements leaning precariously over stinking alleys, the air thick with the reek of sewage and hopelessness. Here, the working poor were crammed into crumbling hovels, entire families squeezed into single, fetid rooms with scant light or fresh air. The slums of Whitechapel and Spitalfields were notorious rookeries where refuse festered underfoot. Sanitation was a luxury beyond reach. No proper sewers, no running water. Human waste and rotting garbage festered in overflowing cesspits and gutters. In these wretched streets, we meet young Jack, a wiry 12-year-old with nimble fingers and sharp eyes. By day, Jack is a mudlark, one of countless children scavenging the Thames' muddy banks at low tide, hunting for lumps of coal, scraps of rope, or, if fortune smiles, a coin dropped by a passerby. The muck sucks at his bare feet, shards of glass and pottery slicing his soles. Yet Jack endures. A good day means enough coal to keep his family's hearth burning for a few hours. But Jack is also a tosher, braving the foul sewers to hunt for valuables washed down from the streets above. Holding his breath against the stench, he squints in the dim light filtering through grates, ears pricked for the rush of rising tides. To be caught in the sewers when the water surges means near certain death. But for Jack, the risk is worth a few coins to quiet his family's gnawing hunger. Jack is among the lucky ones, if such a word applies. At least he has a family and a place to lay his head, even if it's a filthy corner of a crowded room. For those with nowhere to turn, the workhouses loom, grim institutions offering meager meals and beds in exchange for freedom. These places are more prison than refuge, with their rigid rules, forced labor, and stripped dignity. Families are torn apart, meager belongings confiscated. The able-bodied break stones or pick oakum until their hands bleed, while the sick and elderly languish in damp wards. Dinner is a tasteless gruel ladled into crude bowls. Yet for many, it's still preferable to starving on the streets. One who knew the workhouses all too well was Annie Chapman, a woman who'd later meet a gruesome end at the hands of Jack the Ripper. As a girl, Annie sought shelter in workhouses when her family fell into destitution. Later, she turned to prostitution to survive, haunting Whitechapel's shadowy streets, her thin shawl little defense against the cold or the leers of men prowling the alleys. For those who avoided the workhouses, the docks offered a sliver of hope. The Port of London teemed with ships from across the globe, unloading exotic cargo. Burly dockworkers strained under crushing loads, their backs bent, accidents a constant threat. A broken bone could spell ruin for a man and his family. Others toiled in factories and sweatshops, their lungs choked with smoke as they tended clattering machines under flickering gaslight. Women and children labored alongside them, stitching garments or assembling tiny parts for starvation wages. In 1888, activist Annie Besant exposed the horrors of the Bryant and May match factory. The matchstick girls, some as young as 12, worked 14-hour days in rooms thick with white phosphorus fumes. Many developed phossy jaw, their faces rotting from the poison. Besant's expose, White Slavery in London, sparked public outrage and the landmark Matchgirls strike. For East End's poor, life's drudgery was punctuated by fleeting escapes into oblivion. Opium, cheap and plentiful from British India, flooded the slums. In hazy dens, hollow-eyed men and women sprawled on stained mattresses, lost in narcotic dreams. Gin palaces, with their gaudy gaslights and sawdust floors, promised cheap liquor and rowdy company, though merriment often dissolved into brawls or despair. The streets themselves were often shrouded in pea-soup fogs, noxious miasmas born of coal smoke and damp air. These choking fogs could linger for days, turning noon into midnight. It was in this swirling gloom that terror gripped London in autumn 1888. A shadowy figure stalked Whitechapel, butchering women and vanishing into the night. Dubbed Jack the Ripper, his crimes ignited panic and morbid fascination. 5 women, all impoverished prostitutes, were found brutally mutilated. The police, hobbled by the labyrinthine alleys and suffocating fog, seemed powerless. Wild theories swirled. Was the Ripper a doctor? A butcher? A royal? Despite their efforts, the Ripper was never caught. His legend endures as a symbol of the dangers stalking Victorian London's women. For those living and dying in those streets, justice was rare, mercy rarer. Death was a constant specter, especially for the poor. Disease ran rampant in filthy, overcrowded slums. Cholera, spread by tainted water, could kill a strong man in hours. Typhoid, tuberculosis, and smallpox claimed countless lives. The upper classes turned mourning into an art form. Queen Victoria famously wore black for 40 years after Prince Albert's death. But for the poor, even a proper burial was often unattainable. Desperate families resorted to resurrection men, grave robbers who sold corpses to anatomists. The thought of loved ones dissected on slabs only deepened the misery. Ironically, the poor's suffering became a morbid curiosity for the wealthy. Slumming became fashionable, with genteel ladies and tourists gawking at East End hovels, tossing coins to soothe their guilt. A few, like journalist Henry Mayhew and Charles Dickens, sought to amplify the poor's voices, sparking a reform movement. But change was slow. The Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames sewage stench overwhelmed Parliament, finally spurred action. The grand brick sewers still serving London today were built more to spare elite noses than to save the poor. Gradually, faint glimmers of progress began piercing London's gloom. Reformers like Dr. Thomas Barnardo opened shelters for street children, while the Salvation Army offered soup, soap, and salvation to the destitute. New model tenements emerged, boasting running water and private balconies, glimpses of a better life. Yet for most Victorian poor, hardship remained their constant companion. They toiled, scraped, and suffered in the shadows of the British Empire's splendor, their struggles largely forgotten by history. But their resilience forms an indelible thread in humanity's tapestry. As we survey Victorian London, its fog-choked alleys and gaslit horrors, we see a city of jarring contradictions, magnificent achievements alongside gut-wrenching misery, dazzling wealth beside abject despair. This was an era of progress built on exploitation, of soaring dreams crushed by harsh realities. Though marginalized, the poor mattered. Their stories demand telling. Let us remember these forgotten souls who lived and died in history's shadows. Marvel at their endurance through unimaginable trials. Mourn lives cut short by poverty, disease, and neglect. Most importantly, let their suffering inspire us to build a fairer world, one rooted in justice, compassion, and opportunity for all. Thus concludes our journey through Victorian London's darkness. May these windows into the past deepen your appreciation for those who came before us. As you drift to sleep, may their stories linger and awaken in you greater empathy for all who still suffer in our modern world's unseen corners. Until next time, your humble guide to bygone eras bids you good night. May your dreams be sweeter than history's harsh truths, and may you find solace knowing that even in humanity's darkest hours, the human spirit persists. The plight of London's poor began stirring Victorian society's conscience. Reformers and philanthropists championed change, offering glimmers of relief. Among them shone Charles Dickens, the beloved novelist whose vivid depictions of poverty awakened the public. Born in 1812, Dickens knew hardship firsthand. When his father was jailed for debt, young Charles endured factory work pasting labels on shoe polish bottles. This trauma left lasting scars on the sensitive boy. As Dickens rose to literary fame, he wielded his pen to expose society's underbelly. His novels teemed with unforgettable characters from the lower depths. Oliver Twist begging for more gruel, Little Nell wandering industrial wastelands, Joe the crossing sweeper knowing nothing beyond his street corner existence. Dickens wove biting social commentary into his tales, lambasting the wealthy's greed and institutions like workhouses and debtors' prisons. His popularity ensured these messages reached all classes. Some say his fiction did more for poverty awareness than politicians' speeches. Dickens also co-founded Urania Cottage, a home offering fallen women education and vocational training instead of condemnation. Residents learned sewing and cooking, aiming for respectable employment, often in the colonies. Privately, Dickens aided countless individuals, responding to floods of desperate letters. His moral compass and empathy made him one of the era's fiercest advocates for the poor. Dickens' legacy exemplifies how social change began germinating amid London's squalor. Reformist ideas gained traction thanks to activists, writers, and politicians forcing society to confront injustice. The road remained long, but first steps were taken. Another beacon was Angela Burdett Coutts, among Victorian England's wealthiest women and a philanthropy pioneer. Inheriting a banking fortune at 23, she devoted herself to charity rather than luxury. Burdett Coutts focused on London's East End, financing model tenements to replace slums, establishing sewing schools, and creating shelters for fallen women. Her innovative approach treated the poor with dignity, a radical contrast to typical condescension. She also tackled poverty's root causes, funding sanitation projects to combat disease. Appalled by child labor, she campaigned against using boys as chimney sweeps, a brutal trade where children suffocated in narrow, soot-choked flues. Her efforts contributed to the 1840 Chimney Sweepers Act banning such practices. She also supported ragged schools, providing free education to poor children. Into her 80s, Burdett Coutts poured her fortune into uplifting London's forgotten. Contemporaries described her saintly aura, her face lined with wisdom. Queen Victoria, impressed by her work, made her the first woman granted a peerage in her own right. The Baroness inspired philanthropy among Britain's elite, though some motives were more about social status than genuine care. Top-down charity couldn't erase systemic inequality. The poor remained objects of pity rather than equals. Many clung to the myth that poverty stemmed from moral failings. But it marked a start. Suffering could no longer be entirely ignored. The ranks of reformers grew, every school founded, every disease prevented, every rescued child represented hope against overwhelming odds. As the 19th century waned, London's laborers saw incremental improvements. Grassroots movements won key reforms. The 1867 Reform Act expanded working-class voting rights. The 1870 Education Act established public schools. The 1871 Trade Union Act legalized unions. The 1878 Factory Act limited work hours. Life remained harsh, but seeds of change were sown. Misery that was once ignored now pricked society's conscience. Attitudes shifted, however slowly, toward believing even the lowliest deserved dignity. Victorian London's appalling poverty also birthed a march toward justice. In figures like Dickens and Burdett Coutts, we see glimpses of what determined compassion could achieve, foreshadowing 20th century activism. Next time you admire London's grand architecture, Westminster's halls, St. Paul's Dome, Mayfair's mansions, remember the human costs woven into their foundations. But also recall the stubborn sparks of decency that took root in brutal times. Picture young Jack the Mudlark, scavenging the Thames banks, and the Baroness pressing a coin into his grimy hand with a kind word. Such small moments of humanity mattered. In individual acts of kindness piercing Victorian despair, we find hope. The promise that empathy and determination can build a society honoring every life's worth. The Victorian cult of death cast long shadows over London, where disease and short lifespans made mortality omnipresent. While the rich could afford lavish funerals, the poor faced undignified ends, sometimes even grave robbery for anatomical study. Queen Victoria epitomized this morbid obsession. After Prince Albert's 1861 typhoid death, she plunged into perpetual mourning, wearing black for 4 decades, avoiding public appearances, even having servants lay out Albert's clothes daily. This set mourning trends. Widows wore heavy black, weeds, for years, with strict rules governing veils and jewelry. Businesses catered to grief, black-bordered stationery, funeral biscuits, rented mourning attire. Even condolence notes followed rigid protocols. The wealthy memorialized their dead with extravagant funerals and ornate headstones. An entire industry arose. Professional mourners padded processions. Memento mori, tokens incorporated hair or ashes of the deceased. Post-mortem photography preserved loved ones' final images, often their only photographs. But for London's poor, death was stripped of ceremony. Many couldn't afford coffins, let alone Victorian mourning trappings. Pauper funerals were bare affairs, sometimes burying multiple bodies in single graves. The indigent rested in unmarked plots, their lives and deaths unrecorded. Worse was resurrection men, stealing corpses for anatomists. With legal dissection restricted to executed criminals, medical schools faced cadaver shortages, fueling a gruesome black market. The poor, buried without secure coffins or guards, were prime targets. Death's indignities mirrored the oppression the poor endured in life. While the bourgeoisie paraded grief as dignified performance, paupers faced anonymous burials and body snatchers violations. Like much in Victorian society, death rituals highlighted the chasm between privilege and powerlessness. Yet even as Victorians solemnly revered death with one hand, they curiously indulged in poverty tourism with the other. The grim lives of London's poor became a voyeuristic spectacle for the wealthy through the practice known as slumming. Escorted by police or enterprising locals, well-to-do Londoners would venture into notorious districts like Whitechapel or the rookeries of St. Giles, observing how the other half lived as if visiting some human zoo. They gawked at families crammed into crumbling tenements while delicately sidestepping the raw sewage flowing through streets. Some even dressed in shabby disguises, exchanging silks for rough woolens to briefly blend in. Of course, these sanitized excursions offered only superficial glimpses of poverty through the comfortable lens of privilege. The wealthy could satisfy their morbid curiosity during an afternoon stroll before retreating to their carriages and Georgian squares, leaving the poor to their unrelenting misery. For the underclass, the deprivation that slummers found so fascinating wasn't some passing spectacle. It was their inescapable reality. Not all slumming stemmed from idle curiosity. Pioneers like social investigator Henry Mayhew and novelist Charles Dickens documented slum conditions to spur reform. Mayhew's groundbreaking book London Labor and the London Poor provided the first systematic study of street vendors, beggars, and scavengers. Dickens channeled his own impoverished childhood into novels filled with sentimental yet eye-opening portraits of workhouse orphans and street urchins. While reformers like Mayhew and Dickens raised awareness, progress crawled at a glacial pace. Many Victorians remained indifferent or openly hostile toward helping those they deemed lazy or morally deficient. For years, slum life inspired more gawking than meaningful change. Gradually, however, the sheer scale of suffering began piercing society's conscience. Crusading journalists, philanthropists, and newly formed charities cast harsh light on how Britain's mighty empire failed its most vulnerable citizens. Small reforms took root, though agonizingly slow for those drowning in misery. Religious groups like the Salvation Army, founded 1865, offered aid under the banner of Christianity with rolled-up sleeves, providing food, coal, and shelter alongside evangelical preaching. Activists like Dr. Barnardo and Lord Shaftesbury championed child welfare reforms, sheltering street urchins and campaigning against child labor horrors. London's horrific housing also drew reformers' attention. American journalist Jacob Riis's exposé How the Other Half Lives spurred slum clearance efforts and new model dwellings like the Peabody Estates. While these tenements represented marginal improvements over rookeries, they still fell woefully short of humane housing. Other tentative steps included the 1870 Education Act funding schools and settlement houses aiding poor families. But the pace of reform never matched the urgency of need. Hundreds of thousands continued languishing in squalor for decades. It would take a public health catastrophe to trigger one of Victorian London's most transformative reforms. For years, the city's primitive sanitation system struggled under mounting waste. Human excrement and industrial runoff seeped into leaky cesspools and crude sewers, emptying directly into the Thames, contaminating water supplies and spreading cholera. The crisis reached its climax during the sweltering summer of 1858 with the Great Stink. Record heat combined with drought left the Thames a stagnant, reeking stew of sewage. The stench became so overpowering that Parliament hung chlorine-soaked curtains over windows, with politicians carrying scented handkerchiefs to suppress gagging. Fears that they fetid miasma would trigger another cholera epidemic finally forced action. Legislatures funded the Metropolitan Board of Works to construct an ambitious sewer network designed by engineer Joseph Bazalgette. His solution? Over 1,100 miles of brick-lined intercepting sewers diverting waste downstream. The southern outfall sewer alone stretched 7 miles. Bazalgette also constructed the Thames embankment to beautify and sanitize the riverfront. Completed in 1865, this engineering marvel drastically improved public health. Cholera cases plummeted as the Thames began recovering from centuries of abuse. Yet for all this progress, London's poor still faced crushing hardship. Children labored in dangerous factories and scoured scrap heaps. Women sold matches or turned to prostitution to survive. Families wasted away in workhouses and rookeries. The Ripper murders of 1888 embodied this enduring suffering. 5 impoverished prostitutes brutally killed in Whitechapel's shadows. The Ripper's blood-soaked spree held up a mirror to society's failures. His victims, Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane, became tragic symbols of urban poverty's human toll. Their mutilated bodies, displayed across penny dreadfuls, forced London to confront the misery it had long ignored. Strangely, the Ripper's reign of terror also marked a turning point. The media frenzy and public outrage began cracking Victorian indifference. There was growing recognition that allowing an entire underclass to fester in squalor carried dire consequences. Of course, this awakening didn't happen overnight. The poor would keep struggling for generations. But the Ripper murders became a flashpoint, a grim reminder of what neglect could unleash. They forced London to stare into the abyss of its own making. Today, Jack the Ripper's identity remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. But his victims, their lives cut short by poverty and violence, still speak to us across the centuries. They remind us that true progress isn't measured in empire and industry alone, but in how we treat our most vulnerable. The East End of London stood as a festering wound in the empire's glittering capital, a labyrinth of crumbling tenements where the air hung thick with despair. In 1888, this already blighted district plunged into new depths of terror when a series of gruesome murders sent shockwaves through Victorian society. Between August and November of that fateful year, 5 women met horrific ends at the hands of a shadowy figure who would become immortalized as Jack the Ripper. All victims were prostitutes eking out precarious existences in Whitechapel's squalid streets. Their deaths followed a chilling pattern: throats slit with surgical precision, bodies mutilated with anatomical knowledge that suggested medical training. The first canonical victim, Mary Ann Nichols, called Polly by friends, was discovered in Bucks Row just before dawn on August 31st by a cart driver. Her abdomen had been ripped open with what investigators described as considerable violence, intestines draped grotesquely over her shoulder. The brutality escalated with each killing. Just 8 days later, Annie Chapman's body was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, her uterus surgically removed. On September 30th, the so-called double event claimed Elizabeth Stride, whose throat was cut but left otherwise unmutilated, suggesting the killer was interrupted, and Catherine Eddowes, whose face was hacked beyond recognition. The final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, suffered the most savage attack of all in her tiny Miller's courtroom on November 9th. Her heart removed, body virtually butchered beyond human recognition. As the body count rose, Victorian London descended into mass hysteria. Newspapers printed increasingly lurid details, dubbing the unknown killer Jack the Ripper after a taunting letter supposedly from the murderer. The case became a media circus, with penny dreadfuls peddling sensational theories about the killer's identity, perhaps a deranged doctor, a foreign sailor. Even whispers implicated members of the royal family. The police investigation, hampered by primitive forensic methods in the East End's maze-like alleys, floundered spectacularly. Inspector Frederick Aberline, the lead detective, pursued hundreds of leads, from American quack Dr. Francis Tumblety to Jewish bootmaker John Pizer, but all proved dead ends. The killer's apparent anatomical knowledge and ability to vanish into the fog-shrouded streets fed supernatural rumors. Some claimed the Ripper possessed occult powers or was somehow not fully human. When the murders abruptly stopped in November 1888, the mystery only deepened. Had the killer died? Been institutionalized? Fled the country? The unanswered questions fueled endless speculation that continues to this day. But beyond the macabre fascination with an unsolved mystery, the Ripper case exposed uncomfortable truths about Victorian society. These victims weren't just names on a police blotter. They were daughters, sisters, mothers driven to prostitution by economic desperation. In death, they achieved a grim celebrity they never knew in life, their stories laying bare the brutal realities facing London's underclass. The Ripper murders forced Victorian society to confront its own complicity, how its rigid class structure and moral hypocrisy created conditions where such atrocities could occur. The case also highlighted the precarious position of women in Victorian England. Had the victims been wealthy society ladies rather than East End prostitutes, would the police response have been so lethargic? Would the killer have escaped so easily? The Ripper preyed precisely on those whom society had already abandoned, women with no protection, no voice, and little hope. In the years following the murders, the notoriety of the case helped spur social reforms. The East End's appalling living conditions gained new attention, with improved housing and sanitation gradually following. But these changes came too late for Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane, women whose value to society only became apparent in their brutalized deaths. Today, the Ripper's ghost still haunts London's cobblestone alleys on foggy nights. Walking tours retrace his bloody footsteps, while historians debate countless theories. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy isn't the mystery of the killer's identity, but what the case revealed about the society that created both hunter and prey. The real horror wasn't just one man's madness, but the systemic cruelty that made 5 impoverished women perfect victims. The Victorian obsession with death permeated every level of London society, casting a long shadow over daily life. In an era when cholera could strike down a healthy adult by breakfast and life expectancy hovered around 40 years, mortality was the great equalizer that haunted both drawing rooms and slums. But while the wealthy could afford elaborate mourning rituals, the poor faced indignities that extended beyond the grave. Queen Victoria herself became the era's most visible symbol of this morbid fascination. After Prince Albert's 1861 death from typhoid, the grieving monarch transformed into the Widow of Windsor, wearing black crepe dresses for 4 decades and maintaining her husband's rooms exactly as he'd left them. This extravagant bereavement set the tone for Victorian mourning conventions that reached almost absurd heights among the upper classes. For widows, strict protocols governed every aspect of grief. 2 full years of head-to-toe black attire, veils measured to precise lengths, dull jet jewelry instead of shiny gems, black-bordered stationery for correspondence. Entrepreneurs eagerly capitalized on this culture of loss, offering funeral biscuits wrapped in mourning paper, memorial photography featuring posed corpses, lockets woven with hair of the deceased, paid professional mourners to amplify grief. Yet for London's impoverished masses, death brought no such ceremony. The working poor often couldn't afford proper coffins, let alone extravagant funerals. Pauper graves frequently held multiple bodies, with the destitute buried in unmarked plots. The ultimate humiliation came from resurrection men grave robbers who supplied medical schools with cadavers when legal sources ran short. The macabre practice flourished because anatomy laws restricted dissection to executed criminals, creating a lucrative black market. Families would stand guard over fresh graves or install iron morte safes to protect their loved ones. Some even booby-trapped burial plots after the infamous 1831 Italian boy case, where body snatchers were found to have murdered a homeless child for dissection. Disease was the relentless reaper in Victorian London's overcrowded slums. Cholera spread through contaminated water. 14,000 died in 1848 to 49. Tuberculosis consumed entire families. Typhus flourished in workhouse wards. Smallpox left survivors disfigured. Medical ignorance exacerbated the carnage. Doctors initially blamed cholera on miasma's foul odors, rather than contaminated water. This misconception persisted until Dr. John Snow's groundbreaking 1854 Broad Street pump investigation proved the waterborne nature of the disease, one of epidemiology's first major triumphs. The wealthy attempted to quarantine themselves from mortality's reach through elaborate cemetery designs like Highgate's Garden of Death. Post-mortem photography preserving loved ones' final images. Mourning etiquette that turned grief into social performance. But death remained democracy's most relentless enforcer. The same Thames that carried wealthy merchant ships also carried away the slum's sewage. The same fog that lent romance to gaslit promenades also hid infanticides in alleyways. The same industrial progress that built empires also choked paupers' lungs with soot. Nowhere was this dichotomy more apparent than in child mortality rates. Wealthy families, 1 in 10 children died before age 5. Poor families, nearly 1 in 2 children perished. The Victorian celebration of death ultimately revealed more about the living than the dead. Their elaborate rituals weren't just about honoring loved ones. They were desperate attempts to impose order on chaos, to assert control over life's only true certainty. In memorializing death so theatrically, Victorians betrayed their terror of being forgotten themselves. For the poor, this performance was a luxury they couldn't afford. Their grief was raw and immediate, their mourning periods cut short by economic necessity. A widow might be back scrubbing floors the day after her husband's pauper funeral, her black armband the only concession to loss. The working class couldn't afford the Victorian death cult. They were too busy trying to survive it. The Victorian era birthed a peculiar paradox. Even as society turned away from the living poor, it developed an almost theatrical fascination with their dead. This morbid curiosity birthed the practice of slumming, where wealthy Londoners would descend into impoverished districts like anthropologists studying some primitive tribe. Clutching perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses, these poverty tourists picked their way through filth-choked alleys, simultaneously repulsed and enthralled by the spectacle of human degradation. The slumming phenomenon took several distinct forms. Charitable slumming. Reformers like journalist Henry Mayhew ventured into the abyss with notebooks in hand, documenting the lives of street vendors, sewer hunters, and matchstick girls. Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor, 1851, broke new ground by actually recording workers' own voices, a radical notion at the time. Moral slumming. Evangelical groups organized expeditions to save souls in what they called Darkest England. The Salvation Army's 1865 founding institutionalized this approach, blending soup kitchens with scripture readings. Their motto, soup, soap, salvation, revealed the transactional nature of their charity. Voyeuristic slumming. For many upper-class participants, these excursions were simply thrilling entertainment. Parties of gentlemen and ladies would dress in deliberately shabby clothing, bringing spare boots in case theirs got soiled, to gawk at opium dens and penny gambling houses. Some even hosted slumming parties where guests would dress as beggars and drink gin from tin cups. Charles Dickens occupied a complex position in this landscape. While his novels like Oliver Twist humanized the poor, his early career included writing street sketches that sometimes veered into poverty porn. The famous scene of Nancy's murder in Oliver Twist, 1838, particularly fascinated Victorian readers, the brutal killing of a prostitute serving as both social commentary and sensational entertainment. The slumming craze reached its peak during the 1888 Jack the Ripper murders, when guided tours brought thrill seekers to crime scenes. Entrepreneurs sold Ripper knives as souvenirs. Newspapers printed gory details alongside moralizing editorials. This exploitation wasn't limited to the living. The same Victorians who shuddered at body snatchers would pay to visit anatomy museums displaying dissected corpses. The line between education and entertainment blurred disturbingly. Yet from this moral quagmire emerged genuine social progress. The public's growing awareness of slum conditions helped drive the 1875 Artisans and Laborers Dwellings Act, allowing slum clearances. The 1878 Factory Act, limiting work hours. The expansion of ragged schools for poor children. Medical understanding also advanced through this uneasy engagement with poverty. Dr. Thomas Barnardo's photographs of street children, taken before/after rescue, became powerful tools for reform, even as their staged nature raised ethical questions. Florence Nightingale's famous mortality diagrams during the Crimean War proved that statistical analysis could save lives. The slumming phenomenon ultimately revealed Victorian society's fractured psyche. The same industrialists whose factories created urban poverty would donate to orphanages. The same ladies who fainted at vulgar language avidly read murder inquests. This contradiction found its perfect symbol in the 1858 Great Stink, when Parliament finally approved Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system, not because thousands of poor Londoners were dying from cholera, but because the smell of their waste offended legislators' noses. As the century waned, new technologies changed how society engaged with poverty. Flash photography illuminated previously unseen slum interiors. Mass printing made investigative journalism more influential. Railways allowed faster distribution of relief supplies. Yet for all these advancements, the fundamental power imbalance remained. The poor were objects to be studied, pitted, or saved, rarely equals to be empowered. This dynamic would cast long shadows into the 20th century, influencing everything from housing policy to charitable practices. The Victorian slumming craze may have faded, but its legacy continues to shape how privileged societies view and address poverty. Beneath London's glittering surface of progress festered a darker reality. The empire's wealth was built on the broken backs of its poorest citizens. Nowhere was this truth more visible than along the Thames, where armies of mudlarks like young Jack Lucky Jones scavenged the river's filthy banks daily. The 12-year-old's calloused feet navigated broken glass and rusted nails as he combed the muck for coal scraps or lost coins, his hunger outweighing the stench and danger. For these children, the river offered both peril and possibility. Mudlarks braved toxic sludge at low tide. Toshers risked drowning in sewer tunnels. Dredgers sifted through rotting debris. Jack's discovery of a silver pocket watch one morning represented rare fortune, perhaps 2 shillings at a pawnshop. But as he studied the timepiece's intricate engravings, his triumph soured. The artifact symbolized the cruel divide between his world and that of the watch's original owner, some gentleman who'd never know hunger's gnawing pain. This inequality was institutionalized in London's workhouses, deliberately designed to be more terrifying than starvation itself. The 1834 New Poor Law had established these prisons for the poor, where families were forcibly separated, personal possessions confiscated, days filled with bone-crushing labor. Annie Chapman's story epitomized this cycle of despair. After her husband's death left her destitute, the workhouse became her reluctant refuge. The once vibrant woman now shuffled through enforced routines. 5 a.m. wake-up bells. 14-hour days picking oakum. Thin gruel served in tin bowls. When she finally escaped the workhouse's grip, prostitution became her only option, a path that would lead to her brutal murder by Jack the Ripper in 1888. The docks presented marginally better prospects, but at terrible costs. Longshoremen carried 200-pound loads 16 hours daily. Stevedores risked crushing injuries or drowning. Coal heavers developed dockers' lung by age 30. Women and children fared worst in match factories like Bryant and May, where skull and crossbones white phosphorus fumes caused phossy jaw, facial bones dissolving. Skull and crossbones 14-hour shifts paid just 4 shillings weekly. Skull and crossbones fines deducted for broken matches or talking. The 1888 Matchgirls strike, organized by activist Annie Besant, briefly shook public consciousness. Newspapers described girls as young as 12 with glowing jawbones visible through their skin, a horrific side effect of phosphorus exposure. While the strike won minor concessions, most workers returned to the same lethal conditions. For those broken by the system, oblivion came in cheap forms. Opium dens offered dreamless escape for pennies. Gin palaces promised temporary warmth. Suicide rates spiked near paydays when debts came due. The Victorian underworld operated on its own brutal economy. Grave robbers earned £10 per fresh corpse, surgeons' monthly wage. Chimney sweeps bought orphans as climbing boys for £5. Prostitutes averaged 12 clients nightly to afford rent. Yet amidst this darkness flickered sparks of resistance. The 1871 Trade Union Act finally legalized worker organizations, leading to dock strikes winning slightly safer conditions, Matchgirls forming mutual aid societies, literacy programs in underground newspapers. These small victories came at enormous personal cost. Strike leaders were blacklisted, union members jailed, and reformers like Besant labeled troublemakers. But the seeds planted in Victorian London's darkest corners would eventually grow into the labor movement that transformed British society. The River Thames flowed through Victorian London as a liquid metaphor for the era's contradictions, its shimmering surface reflecting the empire's glory while its depths concealed unimaginable suffering. For young mudlarks like Tommy Wilkins, the river wasn't just a waterway but a grueling workplace where each day began before dawn. Tommy's morning ritual never varied, binding his feet with rags against the glass shards, checking the tide tables scrawled on a dockside wall, whispering a prayer to find treasure tide. The 14-year-old knew every mood of the river that sustained and threatened him. Ebb tide exposed coal nuggets near Blackfriars Bridge. Flood tide brought driftwood good for kindling. Neap tide sometimes yielded silverware from West End homes. But the real prizes lurked in the sewer outflows where Tommy ventured as a tosher, despite the risks. Just last winter, his mate Jimmy had drowned when a sudden surge trapped him in the Fleet Ditch Tunnel. Now Tommy carried a rope and candle stubs, poor protection against the black soup of raw sewage that sometimes bubbled up through the grates. The river's gifts were capricious. One foggy November morning, Tommy's numb fingers closed around something metallic, a gold wedding band still clinging to his skeletal finger. The pawnbroker gave him 3 shillings for it, no questions asked. That night, for the first time in memory, Tommy's family ate meat. While mudlarks scavenged the shoreline, the docks teemed with another kind of desperation. Irish immigrant Sean O'Malley, his back permanently bent from years of hauling tea chests, could recite the human cost of every commodity. Sugar equals 2 crushed fingers, Havana, 1878. Cotton equals 1 broken spine, New Orleans, 1881. Rubber equals 3 dead from fever, Belgian Congo, 1884. The workhouses promised relief but delivered torment. Widow Margaret Henley kept a hidden tally of indignities during her 6 months at St. Marylebone Workhouse. 17 beatings for sloth, 3 teeth lost to malnutrition, 1 stillborn child in the infirmary. When Margaret finally escaped, she joined the legions of shawlies, women who sold themselves along the embankment. The going rate was 6p, though drunken sailors often paid half. The Bryant and May Match Factory employed over 1,500 girls in conditions that would shock even veteran slummers. Phosphorus necrosis made jaws glow green in the dark. 14-hour shifts left children blind by age 20. Fine system meant some owed money at week's end. During the 1888 strike, reporter Annie Besant documented how foremen docked wages for coughing, distracting others, charged for drinking water, sold broken matches back to workers as kindling. The labor reforms that followed were meager but groundbreaking. 1889 dock strike won the Dockers Tanner, 6d/hour. 1891 Factory Act banned under 11 laborers. 1897 workmen's compensation provided for injuries. Yet for every small victory, the river kept swallowing London's poor. The weekly dead boat to the pauper's cemetery at Crossness rarely carried fewer than 20 bodies, most unnamed, some in pieces fished from the docks. The water that made London rich would always flow indifferently past its suffering. The Victorian era's most enduring legacy wasn't its grand monuments or imperial conquests, but the quiet revolution in social consciousness that emerged from London's darkest corners. As the 19th century waned, the collective suffering of the poor had begun etching itself onto the nation's conscience with indelible force. This awakening manifested in unexpected ways across London's class divide. In the workhouses, secret literacy circles formed using smuggled newspapers. Kitchen workers deliberately overportioning gruel. Nurses hiding quinine for malaria-stricken inmates. On the docks, cargo mishaps that damaged goods but spared workers. Whistle systems warning of inspector approaches. Hidden ledgers tracking foremen's abuses. In the factories, Matchgirls developing coded coughs to signal rest breaks. Seamstress collectives pooling wages for doctor visits. Engine operators deliberately slowing machines. The Salvation Army's 1885 Darkest England scheme typified this shift, establishing night shelters with free disinfection baths, legal aid for wrongly dismissed workers, emigration programs to Canada/Australia. Even the architecture reflected changing attitudes. The Peabody Estate's 1883 model tenements introduced revolutionary features. Shared bathrooms, one for 20 families. Windows that actually opened. Prohibitions on subletting floor space. Yet these improvements remained agonizingly slow. When journalist George Sims published How the Poor Live in 1883, his descriptions of families sleeping in shifts due to single beds still shocked readers. The 1889 dock strikes hard-won victories, like the dockers' Tanner wage increase, barely lifted workers above starvation levels. The true transformation occurred in the realm of ideas. Social investigators like Charles Booth's 17-year life and labor of the people, 1889 to 1903, systematically demolished the myth that poverty stemmed from laziness. His color-coded poverty maps revealed 35% of EastEnders lived in chronic want. Only 8% qualified as well-to-do. Over 100,000 existed on less than 1 shilling daily. This data became ammunition for reformers like Beatrice Webb, who used statistical analysis to prove 60% of workhouse inmates were there due to injury/illness. Factory wages averaged 22% below subsistence levels. Rent consumed 75% of laborers' income. The 1891 Royal Commission on Labor finally acknowledged systemic failures, leading to free school meals, 1906, old age pensions, 1908, national insurance, 1911. Yet for all this progress, the Victorian era closed with haunting continuities. The 1901 census still recorded 12-year-olds working 60-hour weeks. A life expectancy gaps of 20-plus years between boroughs. Over 1,000 annual deaths from preventable diseases. Perhaps the most poignant legacy appeared in small human gestures. The doctor who accepted turnips as payment. The teacher who washed pupils' lice-infested hair. The costermonger who gave spoiled fruit to hungry children. These everyday acts of solidarity, more than any law or institution, kept hope alive in London's shadows. As gaslight gave way to electric bulbs, the city's poor still carried Victorian scars, but now also carried something new, the unshakable belief that their lives mattered. This fragile conviction, hard-won through decades of suffering and struggle, would light the way toward the welfare state and beyond. The true measure of the Victorian age wasn't in its empire's breadth, but in how deeply its most vulnerable citizens had to fight to be seen as fully human. The final years of Victoria's reign witnessed an extraordinary paradox. The same society that had tolerated East End squalor for decades suddenly developed a moral panic about urban degeneration. This cultural whiplash was perhaps best embodied in the 1890s phenomenon of slum photography, where middle-class reformers armed with newly portable cameras descended into rookeries like social safari hunters. These images walked a fine line between documentation and exploitation. Reformist photography like Dr. Barnardo's before/after shots of rescued children. Sensationalist postcards sold in West End shops showing typical slum dwellers. Anthropological studies measuring paupers' skulls to prove inferiority. The technological revolution extended beyond cameras. Electric trams, 1891, let workers live farther from factories. Typewriters, 1893, created clerical jobs for literate poor. Pasteurization, 1896, reduced infant mortality. Yet these advancements often exacerbated inequality. When the first underground railways displaced slums in the 1860s, the displaced received no compensation. By contrast, the 1894 Cheap Trains Act, which enabled workers to afford suburban housing, was celebrated as a humanitarian breakthrough. Education became the new battleground. The 1870 Forster Act's promise of universal schooling collided with reality. Ragged schools still taught 60 students per teacher. Factory children attended night classes after 12-hour shifts. Half-timers alternated school/work days legally until 1918. The contradictions multiplied as the century turned. Social investigator Seabohm Roundtree's 1901 study of Europe revealed over 25% of urban populations lived below the physical efficiency poverty line. Malnourished workers were 40% less productive. Childhood deprivation permanently stunted development. These findings birthed the uncomfortable realization that poverty wasn't just morally repugnant, it was economically inefficient. The empire needed strong workers and soldiers, leading to school medical inspections, 1907, free tuberculosis treatment, 1912, maternity benefits, 1913. The Victorian era's Closing Act was written in the language of public health. The 1875 Public Health Act's demand for adequate ventilation in factories evolved into occupational safety standards, workers' compensation claims, employer liability laws. Yet for all this progress, the fundamental calculus remained unchanged. When philanthropist Charles Booth proposed old age pensions in 1891, critics warned it would undermine thrift. When trade unions demanded living wages, industrialists predicted economic collapse. The true Victorian legacy lies in how these debates reframed poverty, from individual moral failing to systemic responsibility. The workhouse master's mantra of less eligibility, making relief worse than wages, gradually gave way to recognition of workers' inherent dignity. As London entered the Edwardian era, the city's landscape bore witness to this transformation. Abandoned workhouses repurposed as hospitals, former slums now boasting public baths, children playing where opium dens once flourished. The greatest memorial to Victoria's reign wasn't the marble monuments along the mall, but the handwritten signs in 1,000 alleyway windows. No child labor here. This quiet revolution in human worth, fought for by Matchgirls, Dockers, and Mudlarks, would ultimately prove more enduring than any empire. The twilight of Victorian London witnessed an extraordinary metamorphosis. The very slums that had long been considered moral wastelands began producing their own reformers, poets, and labor organizers. This organic intellectual awakening, emerging from the filth and fog of the East End, would ultimately prove more transformative than all the well-meaning charity from above. Consider the remarkable case of Thomas O'Connell, a former match boy who taught himself to read using discarded newspaper wrappings in the Bryant and May factory. By 1892, he was publishing the Workers' Beacon, a radical newsletter distributed through hidden compartments in dock cargo, hollowed-out loaves and bakery deliveries, false-bottomed market stalls. O'Connell's pamphlets articulated ideas that would later shape the Labour Party. Municipal ownership of utilities, 1889. Minimum wage principles, 1891. Universal health care proposals, 1894. Meanwhile, in the Jewish quarter of Whitechapel, teenage seamstress Rivka Feldman organized clandestine study circles, where workers analyzed marks by candlelight after 14-hour shifts. Their Yiddish translations of Das Kapital circulated through pretend prayer books in synagogue, false linings in garment bundles, coal scuttles with hidden compartments. The authorities struck back fiercely. O'Connell served 3 years for seditious libel. Feldman was deported to Russia in 1895. Meeting halls were padlocked under obscenity laws. Yet their ideas took root. By 1903, over 60% of trade union leaders came from slum backgrounds, a dramatic shift from the 1860s when unions were dominated by skilled artisans. This new generation brought visceral understanding of the arithmetic of starvation wages, the calculus of rent versus food, the epidemiology of overcrowding. The working class intellectual movement manifested in unexpected ways. Dockers universities, informal lectures during lunch breaks, factory floor debating societies, whispered discussions amid machinery noise, prison correspondence networks, encoded messages in laundry marks. Even children participated. 12-year-old mudlark Mary Donovan's River School taught reading using shipping manifests, arithmetic through scrap metal sorting, chemistry via identifying polluted water. The establishment responded with paradoxical measures. Free libraries, 1850 Act, but restricted working-class access. Technical schools, 1870s, that taught obedience alongside skills. Improving literature distributed by churches that omitted class analysis. By century's end, this grassroots intellectual revolution had achieved concrete victories. Worker representatives on factory safety committees, 1892. Labor candidates winning local elections, 1894. Cooperative stores outcompeting company shops, 1896. The true measure of this transformation was visible in the 1897 Diamond Jubilee protests, when dockers displayed detailed cost analyses of royal expenditures. Matchgirls performed satirical plays about wealth inequality. Even workhouse inmates organized hunger strikes. As Victoria's reign ended, the voices from London's shadows were finally breaking through, not as objects of pity, but as political actors demanding fundamental change. The autodidacts of the slums had outflanked the philanthropists, creating a new vocabulary of rights that would echo through the coming century. Their greatest legacy wasn't in laws passed, but in proving that poverty didn't equate to ignorance, that even amid deprivation, the human mind could conceive of justice. As the 20th century dawned, Victorian London's physical and social landscapes stood poised between remembrance and reinvention. The city's infrastructure, once a source of national pride, now creaked under the weight of its own contradictions, with Basilgate's magnificent sewers running beneath streets where children still scavenged for coal. This tension manifested most visibly in 3 transformative projects. 1. The Housing Revolution, 1890 to 1905. The 1890 Housing Act empowered local councils to clear slums, resulting in 15,000 model dwellings built by London County Council. Innovative, if cramped, 2-room apartments replacing single-room hovels. First experiments with indoor plumbing for working-class residents. Yet the human costs were staggering. 32,000 displaced without guaranteed rehousing. New tenements often priced beyond paupers' means. Communal laundries becoming sites of disease transmission. 2. The transportation upheaval, 1898 to 1907. The Underground's expansion promised liberation from overcrowding, but delivered new burdens. 2-hour daily commutes for factory workers. Penny a minute lodging houses near stations. Suburban isolation from community support networks. 3. The electric transformation, 1895 to 1910. Gaslight's gradual replacement brought unintended consequences. Brighter streets reduced crime but eliminated shadow economies. Factories extended hours with artificial light. Electric trams created new pedestrian hazards. The psychological impact was equally profound. For the first generation to experience these changes, childhood memories of oil lamps clashed with teenage years under electric bulbs. Grandparents' tales of the 1858 Great Stink seemed fantastical. The very concept of night was redefined by shift work. This discontinuity created a peculiar nostalgia. Music hall songs memorialized the camaraderie of courtyard water pumps, the good old days of visible stars through coal smoke. even the colorful curses of departed slum landlords. Meanwhile, social investigators uncovered disturbing continuities. 1903 surveys showed 40% of schoolchildren still malnourished. Life expectancy in Bethnal Green remained 20 years below Kensington's. Over 100,000 Londoners relied on pawnshops for survival. The new century's most symbolic clash occurred in 1901, when workhouse inmates were forced to parade before visiting German sociologists, an echo of the slumming spectacles of the 1880s. But this time, the paupers fought back, deliberately mismatching clothing to confuse observers, feigning ignorance of English when questioned, secretly distributing leaflets about their real conditions. This quiet rebellion signaled a fundamental shift. The urban poor were no longer passive subjects to be studied, but active participants in shaping their narrative. As Victorian institutions gave way to Edwardian reforms, London's underclass carried forward both the scars of oppression and the hard-won tools of resistance. The greatest testament to their resilience wasn't in the grand reforms, but in the everyday perseverance that turned survival into a form of victory. The final metamorphosis of Victorian London's social fabric unfolded not in grand legislative chambers, but in the thousand mundane spaces where ordinary people reclaimed their dignity. This quiet revolution manifested in subtle yet profound ways that reshaped the city's soul as much as its skyline. In the workyards, former child laborers now grown taught their own children forbidden skills: how to recognize exploitative contract clauses, the art of slowing machines without detection, secret knock systems to warn of inspector visits. Along the Thames, mudlarks organized treasure schools where river currents were mapped for salvage patterns. Pawnbroker cheating techniques were documented. Legal rights regarding river fines were memorized. In the marketplaces, costermongers developed sophisticated resistance economies, collective insurance against police fines, underground lending libraries in vegetable crates, rented Sunday-best clothing for court appearances. The physical city itself became a living textbook. Street urchins like 14-year-old Nora Flynn could read a building's history in its brickwork patterns, calculate fair wages from factory smoke output, predict rent hikes by counting new gas meters. This street-taught intelligence fueled remarkable innovations. The 1897 Pensioners' Revolt, where elderly paupers sued workhouses for stolen possessions. The 1902 Dockers' Encyclopedia, handwritten manuals of labor rights. The 1905 Slum Architects movement redesigning overcrowded rooms for ventilation. Even play became resistance. Children's games evolved to mock their oppressors. Jack the Nipper, tag with factory overseer roles. Workhouse bells, jump rope rhymes about food portions. Graveyard hopscotch, played on pauper burial markers. The establishment responded with paradoxical reforms. Spade suit free school milk, 1906, but from cows fed distillery waste. Spade suit public baths, 1878, with timed cold water only. Spade suit model tenements, where rent consumed 85% of wages. Yet the human spirit proved irrepressible. When philanthropist Octavia Hill introduced window box gardens to slums, residents grew medicinal herbs to bypass chemist costs, cultivated flowers for funeral trade income, used plant dyes to mark unsafe landlord properties. The true legacy of Victorian London's poor wasn't in what was done to them, but in what they forged from adversity. A scrap metal worker's ability to identify quality or became the skill needed to analyze wage slips. A Matchgirls' precision with chemical mixtures translated into calculating grocery budgets. The very suffering meant to break them became the crucible that tempered their resilience. As the Edwardian era dawned, these hard-won survival skills began coalescing into something greater, a collective working-class intelligence that would ultimately outmaneuver the empire's might. The children who played workhouse bells would grow up to lead the 1926 general strike. The mudlark who studied river patterns would train the dock union negotiators. In this unbroken chain of quiet resistance lay the real victory over Victorian oppression, not in the dramatic clashes of history books, but in the daily determination to turn every scrap of knowledge into a weapon for justice. The dying gaslights of Victorian London illuminated one final, unexpected transformation, the metamorphosis of urban suffering into cultural capital that would redefine British society. This alchemy turned the very symbols of poverty into wellsprings of creativity and solidarity that outlasted the empire itself. In the music halls, former child laborers crafted a new vernacular art form. Songs like My Old Man's a Dustman reclaimed working-class identity. Comic routines satirizing factory foremen drew packed houses. Acrobatic acts replicated the dangerous agility of chimney sweeps. On the printed page, slumborn writers pioneered gritty realism. Arthur Morrison's A Child of the Yago, 1896, depicted rookery life without sentiment. Margaret Harkness in Darkest London, 1888, exposed sweatshop conditions. Autobiographies like A Workhouse Boy's Progress became unlikely bestsellers. Through the lens, Jacob Riis-style photography evolved into social documentation. Reformer Thomas Holmes' portraits of criminal types challenged stereotypes. Anonymous snapshots captured spontaneous street scenes. Post-mortem images memorialized paupers with unexpected dignity. This cultural flowering coincided with institutional shifts. The 1902 Education Act created scholarship ladders. Mechanics institutes expanded night school offerings. Trade unions established reading rooms and debating societies. Yet the most profound changes occurred in everyday spaces. The pub backrooms where irregular chess tournaments used homemade pieces. Workers pooled pennies to buy encyclopedias. Illiterate dockers memorized Shakespeare through recitations. The street markets that became open-air universities for political debate. Distribution hubs for radical pamphlets. Living museums of vanishing crafts. The pawnshops where unredeemed books formed accidental libraries. Musical instruments fostered community bands. Theatrical costumes enabled amateur dramatics. Even the most exploitative institutions inadvertently nurtured resistance. The workhouse became an unlikely literary incubator. Dickens' inspiration forged unbreakable bonds between inmates, inspired Britain's first old-age pension demands. By 1910, this cultural groundswell had achieved tangible impacts. Music hall stars like Marie Lloyd commanded royal wages. Working-class writers dominated penny dreadful publishing. Slum photography exhibitions drew West End crowds. The ultimate irony? Victorian London's attempts to suppress the poor had created the conditions for their cultural ascendancy. The same hands that scrubbed factory floors now penned best-selling novels. The voices once silenced in workhouse wards now filled theaters with laughter and song. The eyes that had squinted through coal dust now produced art that moved nations. As the last Victorian gas lamps flickered out, they revealed not broken spirits, but an indomitable creative force. The empire would fade, but this legacy of transforming oppression into expression, of alchemizing suffering into art, would endure as London's true inheritance. In the end, the measure of a civilization lies not in what it builds, but in what it cannot destroy. The final years of Queen Victoria's reign witnessed an extraordinary phenomenon: the systematic dismantling of the very institutions that had defined early Victorian cruelty, often by the very people who had suffered under them. This quiet revolution unfolded not through grand decrees, but through countless acts of everyday defiance that collectively eroded the foundations of oppression. In the workhouses, aged inmates turned the tools of control against their oppressors. Infirmary chroniclers secretly documented malnutrition deaths. Kitchen workers developed gruel code to warn of inspector visits. Laundry women starched masters' collars with skin-irritating powders. On the shop floors, factory hands engineered subtle sabotage. Loom operators wove hidden protest messages into textiles. Typesetters inserted anarchist slogans in newspaper galleys. Dockers arranged cargo to spell strike from warehouse windows. Through the legal system, paupers became adept at using the master's tools. 1893, Workhouse inmates successfully sued for stolen possessions. 1897. Matchgirls won compensation for phossy jaw injuries. 1901. Scavengers established legal claim to riverbank fines. This institutional judo reached its peak in education. Ragged school graduates began teaching street children. Factory half-timers smuggled textbooks to night classes. Even prison libraries became incubators for radical thought. The physical city itself transformed into a classroom. Pub walls displayed workers' rights posters as entertainment. Market stalls hid political pamphlets in vegetable crates. Pawnshop windows arranged unredeemed books as silent protests. By the dawn of the Edwardian era, this grassroots legal revolution had achieved remarkable feats. The 1906 Trade Disputes Act protected union funds. The 1908 Old Age Pensions Act abolished workhouses for seniors. The 1911 National Insurance Act recognized health as a right. Yet the true victory lay deeper. Former mudlarks now sat on school boards. Matchgirls' daughters entered teaching colleges. The grandchildren of resurrection men became medical students. The institutions meant to break spirits had instead, through the prisoners' own ingenuity, become ladders of ascent. As London's last Victorian workhouse closed in 1929, its final inmates included a former child sweeper turned union organizer, an aged match girl teaching literacy classes, one-time mudlarks now serving as city councilors. The Great Will had come full circle. What began as a machinery of oppression ended, through the determined efforts of its victims, as an anvil upon which justice was forged. The poor of Victorian London left their descendants not just tales of suffering, but the blueprints for liberation, written in the shorthand of everyday resistance, waiting to be decoded by each new generation. As the Victorian era breathed its last, London stood at a crossroads between its oppressive past and an uncertain future, a transition illuminated not by the flickering gaslights of the old order, but by the incandescent sparks of human resilience. The city's poorest residents, through generations of silent struggle, had planted seeds of change that would blossom in ways even they could scarcely imagine. In the courtrooms, former workhouse children now argued cases with hard-won eloquence. 1889 dock strike precedents were cited in labor disputes. 1891 Factory Act violations became test cases. 1901 paupers' claims established new property rights. Through the press, self-taught journalists documented their world with piercing clarity. Former match girl Rebecca Cohen's Bread and Roses column, 1902 to 1912. One-time mudlark Thomas Kelly's Illustrated River Folk series. Sewing collective leader Mary O'Donnell's exposes of sweatshop conditions. In the classrooms, a pedagogical revolution took root. Arithmetic taught through household budgeting. Geography lessons tracing imperial trade routes. Literature classes analyzing Dickens as social commentary. This quiet upheaval reached its symbolic climax during the 1902 coronation riots, when costermongers' carts displayed protest banners disguised as decorations. Factory bands played revolutionary anthems as patriotic marches. Street artists distributed subversive cartoons as commemorative prints. The establishment's response revealed their growing unease. Spadesuit 1903. Special police units formed to monitor working-class intellectuals. Spadesuit 1905. Sedition charges for teaching economics in union halls. Spadesuit 1907. Attempted censorship of autobiographies by former paupers. Yet the genie could not be forced back into the bottle. By 1910, 60% of London school teachers came from working-class backgrounds. Workers' institutes circulated over 100,000 books annually. Former slum dwellers held elected offices in 14 boroughs. The ultimate testament to this transformation came not from statistics, but from lived experience. Grandparents who had scavenged coal from the Thames now watched grandchildren matriculate at University College London. Families that had slept 5 to a bed now occupied council flats with private kitchens. The same streets that had echoed with workhouse inmates' shuffling feet now rang with school children's laughter. As the last Victorian workhouses were repurposed, some becoming hospitals, others evolving into community centers, their walls seemed to whisper the lessons of this remarkable journey. That oppression's greatest miscalculation lies in underestimating its victims, that knowledge once unleashed cannot be contained, and that the humblest hands may ultimately reshape the world. London entered the new century carrying this dual legacy, the weight of Victorian injustice and the soaring promise of hard-won emancipation. The city's poor had done more than survive. They had created, from the scraps left to them, a future their oppressors never foresaw. In this alchemy of suffering into strength, of ignorance into enlightenment, lay the true measure of the age, not in what was taken from these lives, but in what they nevertheless managed to give the world.